Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Circling Dialogos and my conversation with Layman Pascal. More about Layman and our conversation in a moment, but first some housekeeping. So, the main thing is Circling into Dialogos workshop, our third one, taught with Christopher and John Vervaeke and myself, will be happening July 9th and 10th. July 9th and 10th. It starts at 10 a.m., it goes till 4 p.m. Saturday and Sunday, Pacific Standard Time. Awesome course, amazing people, a profound methodology, a work in progress, a creative opening, everything else that I can't think of saying about it right now, all of that weekend. To register, links are below. If you are interested in working with me one-on-one, please email me. My email address is below. If you're interested in exploring circling further, there are links to all the courses below, and the Art of Circling year-long course practitioner training is open for registration. All that information is in the show notes. All right, so this is my first conversation with Layman Pascal, and I'm just going to go ahead and read you his bio. Layman Pascal is a public speaker, non-dual theologian, and yoga and meditation teacher, based in Victoria, British Columbia. His family has lived in the coastal islands for 5 generations. He is a writer on themes of cultural philosophy, shamanism, and organic spiritual development. Lately, he has been active as a board member of the Foundation for Integral Religion and Spirituality and a founder of the Beyond Interfaith Project. So Layman is awesome. His mind is unique and his interests expand deeply. I was so impressed, and I think you will be too, the way his response to life is very broad, but yet articulates it into the particulars. He just does that over and over and over and over and over again. He's fascinating to speak with and to listen to. And this hopefully will be just the first conversation between him and I. We have a lot to talk about. So I hope you really enjoy this conversation, and thank you again for tuning in. All right. Mr. Pascal, welcome.
Hello, Sir Guy.
Yeah. So as I was saying, I mostly have gotten to know you through your conversations with Vervaeke, and have to say, both immediately perplexed, impressed, and curious by a bunch of different things that happen at once when I've noticed when you talk, right? Like one level, there's when you talk, and I'm sure you've probably had other people try to articulate this as well, but it's like there's a level of where your completed thoughts, which are kind of maybe what seem like your first approximation of your thoughts, that when they come out of your mouth is would take me about 20 go arounds to be able to say it that precise. And there's a kind of implicit orderliness to your thinking that lays itself out. It seems like on the first try, right? And in a combination with this a stunning radio voice that you have at the same time, and a sense of a really dark sense of humor, which I get the sense that you spend most of the time withholding, which has me just curious about who it is I'm talking to.
Well, that's I would consider all of that to be extremely high praise because those are
Exactly.
things that sound like I want to be that guy that you're describing.
Yes. Yes.
So, anything in particular you want to know, I'm very open to
Yes. Sweet. Sweet.
it.
It's interesting. I'm curious, just in terms of, because you're part of this, and both of us, I guess, in some strange way, we got in contact to, like, we contacted with each other because we're part of a world that not that long ago wasn't even a world, and now it's a world, right? These long form collaborative like dialogues that can go on the internet, and you're part of that. And it looks like you're also part of that because you're also have your own channel. um like what what has that been like for you, just having a podcast and like having conversations with people like Vervaeke and others, and what do you make all this stuff we're doing in these conversations?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we are in it's a world that's slowly naming itself, right? We're in a transition between, for me anyway, a transition between calling it a bunch of overlapping communities and calling it some kind of general thing like the extended liminal web or whatever improvised term anybody's coming up with at the moment.
Yeah.
I think it's a kind of intersection between the history of individuals and communities that have been trying to do kind of a progressive full spectrum internal and intersubjective work,
Yeah.
and the needs of the world moment and the emergence of the new technology that allows us to have this sort of golden age of conversation where anybody can talk to just about anybody. And who knows how long this window is going to last, but we're in it right now.
Right.
Bruce Alderman set up this project for the integral stage originally to be sort of like people would have different perspectives and we would just show them. But it quickly became obvious that what we needed was a dialogical form, and that we needed to be able to really reach out beyond the people that we might ordinarily talk to and get a full sense of the dynamic topology of whatever this zone is that we're in.
Yeah.
And for me, that jived perfectly because I have this kind of in the back of my mind. I grew up listening to Canadian federal radio, right, as a kid.
Right.
And so in my mind, a radio voice is like a normal way of talking to people. I don't think that's true for everyone. At the same time, I have like the same as I have, sleep needs and sex needs and hunger needs. I have a conversation need. And
Yeah.
so it's been perfect for me because if I'm not getting several high level, really rich, challenging conversations each week, something in me is dying. So I need it.
That's interesting. It's funny, you're right. If I, in some sense, so much about what I would even say my self-understanding about who guysengstock is so much a function of these kind of conversations that I've had. And if I wouldn't have had this level of conversation going back from when I was a teenager, I don't even know if I'd have the same sense of self that I do. That's interesting to think about it like a conversational need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's need is an ambiguous term. You can run in a couple of different directions with it. It's
Totally.
certainly something. If I want to be my optimal version of myself, then I need a lot of it. And early on in my life, it was family, it was a couple of friends, it was books. But now there's this other tool or this kind of stained glass window where you can touch almost anybody on the planet. And so you can get a much higher grade because you can sift out the 2 or 3 people in any city from around the world who are ready for the kind of conversation that might give you that feeling, right? And whatever that feeling is, it's as if it's the new religion.
Yeah.
We don't have to call it that, but there's something really sacred and remarkable and nourishing about a certain quality of exchange that I'm either hooked on or morally believe is part of the next transformation of the species. One of those two things.
Both sound good to me. Both sound good to me. You talked about where is it that you come from? Like, do you like, what's your current situation? What do you do? Like, I've seen about this much of your background and the elephant behind you, and like, what's
I grew up in British
family? Are you
Columbia
married?
on a
Anything like
small
that?
island.
What's that?
I grew up in British Columbia on a small island. Now I live in Ontario, so I'm very Canadian despite all of my world travels.
Right.
Uh, got a house and a girlfriend and some half kids and a little clothing shop thing we're trying to run, but mostly I'm trying to do as much of this stuff as I can and balance it with as much practical on the ground yoga and meditative and spiritual instruction and public work, and also as much, uh, you know, hiking in the woods and doing yard work and looking after the housework as I can. There's kind of balance space I need between all those things. So if
Yeah.
I do a couple hours of really high level spiritual intellectual discussion, then I have to really go and look after the potatoes or try to fix the plumbing or something, because there's a sweet spot between those which feels
Yeah.
necessary.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah. And so you're you have a couple half kids,
Yeah, they're her kids from a previous relationship, so we have them every other week.
right?
So I never really wanted kids, but I ended up having a couple of god kids and looking after a variety of kids. So now
Yeah.
that there's some in the house, it's really interesting because, first of all, it's easy when you like them. You don't necessarily like kids just because they're kids,
Yeah.
but it's a great opportunity to observe developmental processes
Yeah.
and try to gracefully apply your experimental insights into what might facilitate that process.
Totally. I'm curious to hear what kind of like little things that you're getting out of that. Because I have I actually helped raise two girls. I have a son who's 18, and then I just had another one who's 9 months. And first of all, it's interesting going back in time and like looking at through my own lens what I was able to see versus what I'm able
Yeah.
to see now. But I think like one of the things I'm just so, and it's kind of harkens to what you talked about with conversation and this interesting thing about this, like what exactly is a conversation, what does it produce, and what's essential about it, right? And now you and I would imagine, have a certain develop proclivity for it, right? But it seems like that there's something that like is common to all human beings, right? That, and I'm seeing this in the current version with my son Teague, who it's so interesting to kind of get this sense where by the time he says I, right, which is probably going to be, I don't know, 2, 3 years down the road, and like maybe even more years than that for it to be consistent. By the time he says I, he's swimming in an inner subjectivity, right? So even that sense, I was just thinking about this, even just that sense of when he goes to say I, what he's really going to be, that I is going to be delivered or given to him or emerged out of, essentially, he's going to be the one that everyone's been talking to for the last 4 years, right? And so, in some sense, this I is been birthed or emerged or realized through in and through inner subjectivity and through conversation and through us interacting with him. In fact, I would imagine, depending on how great or awful those interactions have been, will determine a lot about what he calls I and what this I kind of first comes up with and what that determines that. But it's got me kind of seeing that and being around that whole process with him. And as he's acquiring, like, I think he's got 3 or 4 words now, and realizing, like, I don't even know where those words came from, if they came from him, if they came from us, or it seems like it's somewhere in between. Um, and then watching my own experience of this profound experience of conversation and watching how much it's expanded me and my own horizons and my own development. And so I would just imagine that there's something so essential about conversation that goes all the way down, right, in us, that like, I don't know how old your kids are or how long you've been around them, your god kids and stuff like that, but like, what have you seen developmentally being around them with all the different frames that you've developed through the years?
There's the first thing I do in my mind is go to the notion of like the individual that comes down to us through Deleuze, this concept of thinking of ourselves not quite as a, rather than I'm an I and then I branch out into relationship.
Yeah.
Actually, I experience the other and then I enter into relationship and then I slowly develop some kind of performance that I call an I.
Yeah.
That's down the road. The relational thing comes first, which seems very appropriate to living in a network-based society.
Yeah.
The individual sort of has there's like an inner plurality, and then there's the fact that we're actually kind of different people for different contexts and conversations. And then there's also this sense that the experience of the self is not primarily, but as a kind of side effect. It's kind of mediated through the other. Right. There's some notions of that the sense of the self loops through the other, and you get the self as a result of an interactive process.
Yeah.
So that's something in my thinking that I bring into my interactions with kids and with everybody. But it's based in temperamental aspects of my character, but also the way my parents related to me. I think there's some, before you even talk, there's something like that relational conversational dynamic where if you think there's something behind my eyes and there's something behind the child's eyes too, and you're looking at those eyes as if behind their eyes is connecting to behind your eyes, right? That opens up a different kind of relating to them, right? There's something else that's going to go on. It's going to change you. It's going to change them. It's going to be a kind of sacred co-participation together. And it demands that you listen for things that are subtler and more nuanced that you might otherwise slip out of your, focused attention and interest at the moment. How are they saying this? Why are they saying it? Are there things that make me a little bit anxious that I have to let go of in order to go with the flow of what we're doing together? Things like that are very interesting to me. Like there's one of the things I loved about the way my father parented, which was that he very seldom said, don't do that. He always said, here's how to do that better. Even if it was something where clearly you could emotionally tell he was not impressed that you were engaged in this activity.
Yeah.
What he did was say, hey, we could finesse that. You could do that better. And I think that's one of the things that people can dialogically co-create is this sort of tactical, reciprocal focus toward not necessarily the good, but toward the virtue of whatever you're trying to do in any activity.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'll do with the kids, like if somebody like, how was school? Oh, it was fine. Because, it's a very neutral kind of question. But when you ask what was the best thing or what was the worst thing at school, then the attention in the conversation is pivoting toward a more precise evaluation, right? And just like, so helping someone do something better, asking them for a deeper evaluative clarification, you're kind of co-prompting each other to have your attention go to a more precise tip of evaluation, which is very analogous to a lot of internal and meditative practices.
Yeah. It's like is it something like the more precise it is, the more of a sense of an optimal grip you can get with more of yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? You have noticed that.
So it's less clunky and you're also closer to the experience of value. I think that's one of the things that's easy to overlook is you're close to value when the valuing is negative or positive. This is one of the things I love about Nietzsche, who I keep coming back to in my own experience a lot, which, Nietzsche said, what's the famous phrase? He who despises himself still honors himself as the one who despises. Phrases like that are beautiful because it looks like there's a negative evaluation going on. But in reality, the very fact that you're making a more precise evaluation means you're closer to the value that's implied in your evaluating capacity.
Yeah.
And parents are often reluctant to engage in what seems negative with kids.
Yeah.
So you got to get past your anxiety because they might be expressing a more precise value assessment in something that's initially off-putting to you.
Right. And that what okay, that thing that you just said, oh, so I want to pick up on that just really quick. That when even it looks like I'm making a negative evaluation, but what I'm really doing is whether or not it's negative or positive, is I'm becoming close to the experience of value in such a way that my evaluation, is it conforming with that experience of value itself? Is that what, because I'm thinking about the notion of, like, the notion of knowing as conformity, right? This kind of like contactfulness, is that like where my evaluation and the experience of value in the world start to come into conformity, and it's that contactfulness that's important?
I think what's
Thinking about it
important
right,
is
or
that there's a choice of contexts for that contactfulness,
yeah,
right? If I'm looking at a compass uh, and it's showing me that I'm at the South Pole, I also immediately know what direction the North Pole is in,
yeah,
right? So there's a sense in which I could be making contact with the problematic situation of the South Pole,
right,
but in that I also have the exact amount of information I need to know how to orient to and make contact with the North Pole in
right,
that position as well.
right, right. Okay, got you. And so the specificity of the evaluation and the value is something like that, kind of getting where you are in the, like, in the North Pole. If you're in the North Pole, immediately, if you get that you're in North Pole, you automatically know where South Pole is, and then you have a whole world that kind of opens up with you there. Totally. I
Yeah, and there's a very normal way to be like, oh, this sucks, right? And that's fine, and it's clumsy, and you can get neurologically trapped in developing habits of having that negative experience.
Yeah,
But you can also look at it in a way where, like, if this sucks, then I know that it sucks, and therefore I know that it's in comparison to something else
yeah,
that doesn't suck as much, and therefore I know what doesn't suck as much, and
yeah,
therefore I am in immediate contact with my value sense.
totally, totally. And that's kind of a little bit what would you say? Would you say, is this where kind of the postmodern trap kind of gets stuck in, is they forget about a little bit about, like, well, the fact that you just found that completely relative, right, immediately means that there's something that isn't just relative, right, that you found it, and kind of get trapped in just that relativity in that sense, and don't notice this background that's implicit in finding that. Like, I think is it Vervaeke's been calling that the dialectic between the hermeneutics of suspicion and the hermeneutics of beauty, is the language he's been using lately. It,
Yeah. Yeah, postmodernism is a very beautiful set of expanded capacities to understand what's been left out of systems and how pluralistic reality really is, how mutually constructed it is,
yeah,
right? But what do you do with that? Ken Wilber has this beautiful phrase for what he calls like green pluralist. It's
yeah,
also called early vision logic. It's the
yeah,
beginning of something, but you haven't really matured into handling that until you know how to use it to get a return to the basic experience that all beings want, which is clarification and development and depth and the experience of value.
yeah,
And so you can find that from within intercontextuality just as well as you can find it within some kind of monolithic salvational dogma story. In fact,
yeah,
it's probably easier when you're aware of the fact that there are relative determinations of reality, as long as you know personally that that's an option, that you can look for it and find it there, and that your, let's say, bio-emotional physiology permits you to have that experience. Because I think one of the things that gets overlooked in a lot of these discussions is it's just not just a matter of philosophy. You,
yeah,
you have to be able to feel value. You have to be
yeah,
able to feel love. You have to be able to feel ecstasy. You have to be able to feel compassion. And that's emotional and physiological. If you can't do that, then um, the best philosophy in the world isn't going to help. It still has to move through your organs.
yeah, yeah, totally, totally. You talked about with your dad, this, like, cool thing that your dad used to do. Like, where did for you, where did the world of like philosophy and this whole conversation that we're kind of inside of, when did that open up for you? Did it have to do with your dad? Did it have to do with your family? Like when did when did this open up for you?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing comes to my mind is my maternal grandmother.
Hmm.
I don't remember the conversations I had with her. She died when I was very young, but I'm told she and I would go for a lot of walks and talks in the woods. And she left me a series of books that I couldn't read them yet, but I was aware of them. They were on the shelf and they were for me. And they were largely early 20th century meditation texts and reflections on alchemical and hermetic philosophy and things like that that she found very exciting. So there was that. There was my mother was a very, uh, in her own way, a very literate spiritual person. She used language very richly. She was very focused on a kind of participatory experience of reality. My father was more uh, like a Taoist adventurer, farmer, practical guy
Yeah.
who would drop little pithy aphorisms once in a while. But I also think it was largely a result of fiction in some ways that I got into science fiction and fantasy early on because it was mentally inspiring and reflected some of the magical qualities of the environment I was in.
Yeah.
And that very naturally seemed to me to move into um, multiple mythologies, Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung, and creative mythology and new imaginative religion.
Yeah.
And then I was just running into problems. How can all of these religions, how can all of these experiences simultaneously be true? So I kept having to put it back together again.
Huh.
And as a result of constantly trying to put all the chaos I was finding back together, you end up finding people who've also been looking at that problem. And then you read them and then you want to put them together and it kind of moves you along.
Huh.
Although a lot of personal strange experiences, a lot of interest in magic and occultism and stuff like that, as well
Yeah.
as just a kind of open-minded, which I think was in my family, a really open sense of
Yeah.
let's understand what other people are doing. And if that other thing they're doing is religion, good, let's check them all out. Let's go and have the experience and see what they're talking about.
High in openness, your family was. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. And I loved how you just described that. Like, because it sounds like you're high in exploration. So it's like you're going to explore internal worlds and external worlds, and that's going to introduce you to all kinds of perspectives. But then you sense that there's something coherent, or at least need there to be a coherence amongst everything that you're talking about, which has you start to intuit the through line and bring it all together. I just love that, the kind of dialectical, natural, almost like a natural dialectical movement that you just described with your life and growing up. And it sounds like your parents and your family had the openness for that exploration to be really encouraged.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think that's actually what I sense implicit in your thinking, right? Which I really am appreciating. Just even just the way that you just laid that out very much describes the thing that you were just talking about. Like the way you laid that out, right, verbally, and what you described verbally were very coherent. That through line through all of it is really apparent in my listening of you, anyways.
Well,
Makes
I appreciate that. It's certainly it's aspirationally important to me to keep the different aspects of my experience really closely together, right? So it's more important for me to chew an idea and make it become part of my lived experience and connected to where I come from and connected to dreams and nature and my sexual relationships and the way I eat and all this, like to bring those really closely together rather than to have a domain where I have a whole bunch of ideas
totally.
that aren't connected to my lived experience, right? It's become, I consumed books really ravenously when I was young,
Huh.
but I started to get this sense that it's much more important to reread complex books than it is to read a new book, right? That there was something in me that was like, okay, this this is relatively superficial. I'm not interested in having more access to ideas and opinions. I'm interested in more deeply assimilating the things that I find the most enchanting and difficult into my everyday experience. So they show up when I'm brushing my teeth. That's what I want.
Totally. Huh. You see, you just had me kind of realize something about like what gripped me about Heidegger, right? When I was in my early 20s. I mean, I have dyslexia and all kinds of, I couldn't learn how to read until I was like 11. Had an amazing like reading teacher, special ed teacher that somehow taught me how to read with my right brain or something. But like something in Heidegger struck me, and I can't even say that I can't even honestly say that I still understand what Heidegger's talking about. But like, there's something about returning to him and struggling with that text that I would have to say has been so, like, not informative, but informing, right? In some sense, just the walks that you have to go through intellectually and cognitively and emotionally, working out that kind of thinking. I've been, it's so hard to put that into words, right? But I think what you're talking about kind of helped me shed light on that very kind of process of reading philosophy. Is that who were some of the earlier enigmas and people that you grappled with, the like the texts that you kept returning to? Who were some of the early ones for you?
Well, let me first say that I had an early 20s experience with Heidegger myself,
Oh, you did?
where because I was very interested in anybody I thought was saying something about what was on the other side of postmodernism. And he was one of the people I thought might have something to say about that. And it was very difficult, very dense. And I remember, okay, this is the setup for that. Is when I was a kid, I did a lot of inventing my own wilderness sports. This is mostly what I would do with my friends. And one of them was, let's see how far we can go from tree to tree without ever having to come down to the ground. And so you would do this many times, and there would be all kinds of acrobatics that were a little bit characteristic of the process. There was a certain architecture to the dynamism of it. So I'm trying to read Heidegger. And I'm following this sentence. I'm following it along, and there's a certain tempo, and it goes up, and it sort of flips over, and it comes back down, and I blank out for a second. I get to the end of the sentence, and I'm like, I don't even know what he said there. And then I realized I've seen this move before. I did this move between two trees when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Right. I know this move. And it was like my window into Heidegger was making that connection, seeing there was a visceral acrobatics to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
who did I grapple with a lot?
God, that's
the first person I really was impressed by was Robert Anton Wilson, and kind of and he got me into Aleister Crowley and Gurdjieff and Timothy Leary and that kind of 20th century radical neurological evolutionary dynamics stuff.
Right.
And I stayed with a lot of those guys. I grappled with sort of Adi Da and the late 20th century non-dualism stuff.
Yeah.
Gurdjieff is difficult. I come back to him a lot. He has a lot to say. Nietzsche has a lot to say. He's one of those people who you can come back to again and again. And every time you come back to, you're like, oh,
Yeah.
And you don't know if you're finding something he left in there or if it's just a Rorschach where you're seeing yourself reflected back to yourself. But whatever it is, it facilitates that.
It's at least damn good rock soup.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Japanese Zen master Hakuin. Koans in general, I come back to, but Hakuin in particular has these fascinating, rich, vital writings that are incredible. I come back to that a lot.
Oh, interesting. I haven't explored him.
So that's a couple examples.
This is so that I have not quite heard anyone. So the wiggle I had in my stomach when you were just talking about the connection between like listening or like reading Heidegger and struggling to read Heidegger and the whole thought, and then you remembering kind of some vague sense of like, I know this move between trees in this there's there's like a because there's something about that experience. It's been so primary for me, but so difficult to put into words. But I think even I kind of can hear. It's funny. I can hear my grandfather was German and
Hmm.
like very German, and I spent a lot of time with him, and so it's funny. Like there's certain things that Heidegger, I could just tell that there's just certain things that are just so Germany, like with Heidegger that echo my grandfather, but in this non-specific way, but some kind of emotional way of the way he kind of thought about when he was a tailor and the way he would kind of tell stories that are analogous to him, like, doing the thimble and this whole thing. And Heidegger has this very strange way of taking something you can't quite say it's on one level. You could say it's the most abstract thing in the world, but at the same level, at the same time, it's like you're doing the most mundane thing, concrete thing, like climbing a tree. That whole process of hanging out in those two things and struggling with that has just done something to my neurology that feels like it just changed the way I saw everything, right? And just when you said that, I have to say, I don't think I've ever quite felt that wiggle inside of me happen. So I really appreciate what you just said a lot.
Good. I think some of the German thinkers were very good at that.
Yeah.
Einstein said he thought with his muscles, right? And it's particularly attractive to me because I think a lot of what we call spiritual development is a kind of hybridizing between internal systems. So to bring the intellect and the neuromuscular system together, I think is a really potent thing. But there's something about some of the great German thinkers where it's like you feel them crawling around in the landscape, touching solid objects. I hear a little bit in Nietzsche. It's definitely there in Heidegger. There's a sense of this visceral exploration, like they're chewing through it or something.
Yeah. And I would imagine part of the German thing is like the German language. And I don't know German. I'm contemplating on which one to learn first. Is like if I'm going to learn ancient Greek first, or if I'm going to learn German first. I can't quite tell which one I'm going to do first, but I want to. But my understanding of the German language is that it's on one level it's a lot simpler, but that simplicity seems to afford these extension of these verby nouns that you can do that can stretch things, that kind of can keep this level of abstraction and this level of concrete really close together somehow in the same word. Do you know anything about what do you think it is about the Germans and that sense that we're talking about? Do you have any thoughts about why is it that the Germans, what's German about that, or what makes it?
Yeah, it's hard to know whether we're really talking about the Germans or like a greater sort of
Yeah,
Germano-Nordic linguistic zone.
totally.
Right,
Yeah,
a good chunk of my ancestors are Scandinavian,
yeah,
and I find something very very earthy in what they're trying to do, and that the way they phrase things is simultaneously romantic and mechanical and plodding and exquisite and deep. And they just have a certain, I mean, there's a certain bloody mindedness to it, right? Like what I hear in the syntax is like people just marching through darkness, marching through the swamp, and just keeping going.
yeah, yeah, totally. Oh, totally. That's totally it. That's totally it. Interesting. Oh, interesting. So, 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 like I'm actually kind of curious about what you. So it sounds like you as well kind of really did grapple with in your early 20s. You were really grappling with the postmodernists and as you said was looking looking to Heidegger in some sense to see if there's anything beyond it or who had something to say about that. Did you ever kind of come to anything about that with Heidegger specifically? I'm sure it led
Well,
into all kinds of other people and stuff.
yeah, there's a lot of dimensions to that. I think any thoughtful, sensitive person is always trying to figure out what it is they love about their time period and what it is they hate about their time period. So they're trying to get a contextual critique of what they think inhabits their world. So I was definitely doing that. And I'd had a particular strange, we might call it spiritual experience that was extended for a couple of weeks and left me really hungry to look for something that was on the other side of postmodernism.
Yeah.
And Heidegger was one of the people I looked to. And what I found in Heidegger was, I think, a sense that we need to leave the thought categories behind and just do the work of rethinking all the parts of our ordinary language and speech. That there's just the phenomenological inquiry part, that if we're going to get to the other side, we need to do a lot more of that.
Yeah.
This question about the age of the world picture that he stood in front of,
Yeah.
right? Like, how important is it? I mean, the world picture is two things. In a way, it's the Earth from space. And what do we do with a cosmic world? And what do we do with the feeling of concern about the world, which is kind of new? Our ancestors didn't have a lot of that. And how does that concern, how does that anxiety become care?
Yeah.
But also, what does it mean to have a world picture, right? To have a paradigm. Before there was Thomas Kuhn, and before there was Foucault's archaeological history, and before there was spiral dynamics and Ken Wilber, there was Heidegger kind of saying that there were these different historical world pictures.
Right.
And that I think, we might imagine we're in a post-narrative, some kind of postmodern zone, but that's got to still be some particular world picture.
Yeah.
So that was there for me as well.
Yeah. So these kind of deep, like these kind of has you look like way back behind your eyes, like, right, and see what's already even presupposed into that and bringing that into light. Yeah. Interesting.
As well as obviously his musings on what technology means, right? And how the notion of the technical itself has held sway for a huge period of time and resulted in the kind of thinking characteristic of modernity. And therefore, when modernity starts to reflect upon itself in the form of postmodernism, to what extent is that reflection still characterized by the same underlying and limiting assumptions of the technological individualistic mindset that's held sway since ancient Greece, or whenever we want to set that date? So that was important to me.
Yeah, his technological writings are just brutal. Like, I mean, with every year that goes by, they just become, like, his writings about that just become more and more and more, like, so prophetic. It's insane. At least that's my view of it. Do you kind of hold the same view of that, or how do you see that?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's our ancestors didn't put as much emphasis on the way that our relationship to the things we use reflects and also generates our thinking, right? That's a relatively new concept. And Heidegger was one of the first people to flesh that out. Right. Another guy like that, as a Canadian, I go to Marshall McLuhan a lot. I studied when I was a kid. Right. But that's a similar kind of thing. How do our relationship to the technologies express and also create our background assumptions about what the world is, and then what's limiting or freeing about that process?
Totally. It's one of the things I've thought about a lot, right? And I think some of this has to do with, kind of looking at circling and looking how circling kind of became a movement, and being one of the people that was at the beginning of it, and watching all the different people that have been involved. It's so clear to me that it's not a function of, like, the emotional health of the individuals, right, that, like, had that spread, right? There's something else going on, and I don't think it's just about the wonderfulness of the technology or not the technology, but the methodology. I think I think what it is that circling happened to just be something like like a a yogic practice of I thou, and it did a good job of just basically kind of limiting it to itself to that experience of the fundamental experience of what it's like to be a person with another person, and kind of doing asanas that isolate all the things that seem to increase the intensity of that experience, right? And I think though that what had that catch or become so important, right? Or even what had it develop as that, right? I think has to do with something I don't hear talked about all that much, right? And I'm curious about if you can kind of like what your thoughts are about this, but like, because this also links to this interesting thing that we're doing right now, right? And this thing about conversation and its availability. Well, what also made that available is one of the things that that I think this started. I think one of the big revolutions or uncouplings that happened in communication was the first time this happened at this level was, I think, the answering machine. I think the answering machine was the first time where you basically have where you're going to have any kind of basic information exchange, where it was the first time where something was available where you could uncouple it from relationship, right? You can exchange the information in this basic way back and forth without having to do the relational thing. And then of course that became text and email and then just the vastness of to where we're at the point where like literally if you think about it, all someone needs is like maybe an internet connection, a computer, and electricity, and the person can become famous, build a company, become a millionaire, and never actually have to come into contact with anybody directly ever. It's like this kind of, and it's like whenever you've uncoupled anything like this, right, with especially communication, that ends up transforming everything. And so my sense is that because relationship is inherently terrifying, right? Like you could say something to me that hurts my feelings so bad that it just changes my life, or you could say something that reveals something about me that can enlighten me. Like that's what's the range of possibilities that just happens when you and I kind of like face each other. That's terrifying. So if I have an option to exchange information without having to go through that, my nervous system is just going to make that choice over and over and over and over again. And so now we're getting to the point where we have people who grew up without a memory before the internet, right? And they're just starting to become adults. And I think we're just starting to find out how weird this makes us, right? In some sense. But I also think that that's why circling ended up spreading all over the world, because it happens to be a concentrate. It's like a gym in a certain sense, right? Like when the Industrial Revolution, I don't think there'd be any gyms if there wasn't the Industrial Revolution, right? Like because there's just so much movement that life necessitated, right? They got taken away. I think the same thing's going on with relationship. I'm just curious about like, what have you thought about that at all? Like, and it's paradoxical because there's also that very technology has extended the ability to kind of like, as you were talking about, to not only have more relationship, but be able to fine tune and sift through it and have like find like little strands of like a certain kind of dialogue with those people at choice in a highly concentrated form. But that very technology seems to afford this other thing that's making everyone autistic at the same time.
I think we have to keep in mind both the circumstance afforded by the technology and also the axis of doing it well or not well, being healthy or not healthy under any condition, right? Like if the situation is a situation of dogmatic scriptural kingdom Christianity. Well, you can still be St. Francis or some jerk fighting a holy war unnecessarily. Right. So under the conditions of relational network dynamics,
Yeah.
we both see, I mean, we see this whole world now. We see the digital network, the neural network, the mycelial networks. We're getting this picture of a interactive relational network universe, but that can be done well or it can be not done well. And when it's not done well, it's a really flattening, like almost mockery of what relationship is. And when it's done well, it can be the most amazing possibility in human history. And one of the things that seems to mediate between that is the contrast afforded by imbalances. So if you're sitting in front of your computer or you're on your phone a lot, you end up feeling that there's a problem, right? And the problem is that, oh, I'm not being embodied enough. I'm not being real enough. I'm not being authentic enough. I'm not having real relationships. That's not a question that our ancestors posed themselves, is how do I really be myself, or how do I have an actual relationship? Right. That question is afforded by the fact of the ambiguity of the relationship status of being involved in these network technologies. So everybody's at this crossroads now in terms of how they approach and inhabit the network relational dynamic universe. And some of those people are going to do it in a way that leads them down to a, what Vervaeke would call, so reciprocally self-narrowing problem. And some of them are going to open themselves up. And some of that opening up is going to be, it's going to strike us as an urgency precisely because we don't see it reflected in our engagements, right? If I sit here on Zoom too long, and yes, we're having relational dynamics, it's great, but I'm going to start to get agitated. And if I experience and interpret that agitation properly, I'm going to know what to do, which is go and be with some people, go and be outside, go and have exercise, go and meditate.
It is, yeah.
Well, I think they throw each other up in the same way that there's sort of always a famous story about how the cool people in society are the opposite of what the society is doing to some degree, right? Like if everybody's working in the fields, then the aristocrats try to look really pale. But as soon as everybody has to be inside of the offices, then you kind of like signal that you're sophisticated by having a tan, looking like you don't have to be in those things.
Yeah.
So there's a part of ourselves that wants to be better, and it wants to be better as an alternative to the thing that we find ourselves embedded in.
Yeah.
But it's also going to subscribe to the logic of what that basic world is. So taking the logic of relationship as the world now, which I think we have to do. How do we do that better? How do we do that worse? And how do we correctly interpret the agitation in order to make ourselves have real connection, which is what the connected world makes us want to think about.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And there is something, I think, I mean, wouldn't you say that there is something about screens and technology that more than anything ever has that phenomena where when you start to feel the pain from the consequence of too much of it, it kind of has you go more towards it. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, I guess it's of course, the analogy is like, it's like a drug or something like that. But there's something about screens that is just pernicious that way, where it's so difficult because because the response of the discomfort from it is obsessively to move more towards it. So to have to remind yourself of it and break yourself away. I mean, I don't know. I keep hearing Heidegger in the background going, yeah, I told you you're inframed.
Absolutely. I mean, and the screen is a literal frame, but I think it's possible to think of the new technology because it's unfamiliar as being very peculiar.
Yeah.
And these are actually very common processes, right? That the human experience of thinking, as all of the sages have pointed out, is the same thing, right? You think of something, or there's a problem, you get anxious, so you think of more things.
Yeah.
But also an emotional person is like that. They have an emotional reaction, it leads to a problem. Well, they have another emotional reaction to try to solve that problem, right? That these chains have a momentum of their own.
Right.
And our problem as multidimensional beings is to somehow splice those chains together to make a wholeness, because any one of these chains can trap us, whether it's the body, the emotions, the mind, the tools.
Yeah.
any one of them is a trap unless we can somehow blend and interconnect them.
Yeah, totally. Totally. This leads a little bit to what you're talking about before. Like, so you, as you were saying, it's an aspiration for you to bring these, like your thinking and your body and like your emotions, to bring these things really close together, right? And synchronize with each other and deepen each other. And you do that consciously and as an aspiration. And I know one of the things about the integral, right, approach, and I like, so I think started reading Wilbur. I read Spectrum of Consciousness when I was like a sophomore or something in high school. So like that kind of way of thinking about things, at least the early Wilbur, goes way, way back. And then of course, in the world of the Bay Area, I've been, although as I was like kind of grappling with Heidegger and those kinds of things, a lot of my friends were really kind of getting into, once Wilbur started having a lot of the maps, and then there was the Integral Institute, and all of a sudden you had something like a deep philosophical mapping that people that wouldn't normally be into that kind of thing were kind of had an entry into it and were engaging in it in a practice way with all the quadrants and all those kinds of things. And it seems like you've jived up, like you seem really, really connected to that way, and also with practices. And you mentioned meditation, and like, what are some of the practices that you get into, like yoga? Like, what are some of the things that you do? And it sounds like you also mentioned that you teach them as well.
Yeah, I don't teach them as much as I used to, but it's the main focus of my life, so to speak. In an average day, I'll do what I call sort of subtle mantra, a little bit like TM practice in the morning. Then I'll do a yoga routine, but I try to do simultaneous heart, mind, and body exercise at once to create a harmonic blending in the Gurdjieffian style.
Yeah.
Usually in the afternoons, I do some kind of insight practice, generally framed around non-dualism in a very broad sense of, like, there can't possibly be a difference between engagement and freedom, so to speak, or my contraction from experience and the experience itself have to be held in equal measure and blended into each other. Or there's a variety of different ways to approach insight practice, and I'm usually coming up with new ones. And that's my afternoon practice. Then throughout the day, there's something like an attempt to deepen the degree to which perception is experienced as nourishing. Right? I have a number of ways trying to do that based on
more about that.
Yeah. So one of the examples I usually give, I don't know if you're familiar with Eugene Genlin's focusing method.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
He sort of, right. So you're going to come up with a felt sense of what the situation is, and then you're going to try to name it. And you have to kind of adjudicate between the concept or the word and the experience, because if they don't match, then you didn't get the shift.
Yeah.
Right. So you're experimenting with one system, and you've got another system in play. You got your proprioceptive felt sense, and you got your analytical verbal thing, and you check no, they check no, and then one of them blends, and you're like, yes, that's the word for what I'm experiencing.
Yeah.
And that's a very core skill that can be used beyond Genlin to do something like this. Gurdjieff points out things like this in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, right? How do you take a novel moment of perception and match it with another system in yourself? Yeah. So you're outside and you see something peculiar and you go, all right, I already know what I know about that. I've got one kind of intelligence system perceiving this. Is there another intelligence system in me that doesn't make any sense to that system, but which could get some kind of resonant blending? So you could start even in a very simple way doing the Genlin thing, like, I saw weird crow behavior. What did it make me feel? Yeah, it made me feel like a Toblerone bar. No, that's not it. It made me feel kind of gritty. No, that's not it. Right? You come up with something, and something finally clicks.
Yeah.
And two different systems in yourself are talking to each other in that moment, and they create more than the sum of the parts. And so
Yeah.
then you have this generalized experience of yourself, and you have an insight that you didn't predict, and you have a deeper, richer experience of the perception, and you think, well, this is fantastic. My whole life could be devoted to this very easily.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah, I could just imagine just like that I mean, I just have a deep body memory. Like, in fact, that thing, whatever that feeling I just had that was just anchored to everything that you just said, I'm like, on some level, that's all I'm after in my life, is to like crawl inside of whatever that is and then just stay there as long as possible. Something like that.
I I have a whole sort of approach to what constitutes the dynamics of spirituality. You're trying to think it in an integral post-metaphysical or a meta-modern way or something like that, in a
Yeah.
way that can like retro-engineer successful historical spiritual practice, but also afford us the possibility of improvising new ones going forward.
Yeah.
And most of how I think about it is around that. How do you blend different intelligence systems in yourself or between people when it becomes religious? But how do you blend that in a way that creates that more coherent, generalized surplus feeling of being that goes beyond what you need in order to adapt to the moment and becomes something that could be a higher self, could be a greater entity, could be another energy, however you want to interpret it.
Oh,
But it just gives you this absolutely visceral sense of having succeeded at something. You think, okay,
yeah.
this is part of the solution to the existential dilemma. And it
Right.
has to do with how we weave parts of ourselves together to create more than our current identity, perception, and cognition.
Yeah. This is great. I mean, it's also, as you're describing it, I'm getting the sense it's like, oh yeah, it's like really like almost like the model-esque way of how to train your dopamine systems on the right thing, right?
Yeah.
Like how to get that feedback loop, because it's that when that moment when it pops, it's like a dopamine storm on some level, and I would imagine with dopamine, which is a lot about memory, right, which is about anchoring that very process, right? Because isn't it, so it's like, because I would imagine that gestalt that forms, right, when that happens is kind of a transcendence, and then as that settles, right, you actually get new content formation within that, and then can have insights about that very content formation that just keeps layering up and up and meditating all the way throughout. That just seems, I just like the way that you just put your finger right on that. That seems super, 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 super central and amazing.
Yeah, well, it strikes me as being very important. And when we look at things like our friend John does in terms of what the meaning crisis is,
Mm-hmm.
part of that is not just, so what are the practices and stories we tell ourselves as a society that give us a sense of meaning or not? Part of it is, what do we actually do with our machinery, so to speak, that generates the experience of meaning, and an experience that we can use. It's dubious what the actual neurochemicals specifically do. We're always finding out new things, but dopamine seems to tag things that are meaningful in
Yeah.
our system.
Yeah.
Right? But how do we produce that? How do you have enough dopamine? How do you have the experience that's going to get tagged? How do you have the new insight that makes it worth it? All these very practical, almost mechanical functions
Yeah.
that connect very strongly with the inner life practices that all of our ancestors were working on. And if we're not doing that, then there really is no solution to the meaning crisis, because you could sell everybody a very exciting story that made them feel very engaged. But if they're not doing whatever it is that goes on internally that produces a sense of meaning that's salient enough to stand out to you beyond your ordinary experience in a moment, well, then it's not really going to work.
Yeah. Okay. And that Eugene Grenlin esque thing that you do. You said you try to cultivate that throughout the day.
Yeah, that's one of my so I have my practices that I tend to do, sit down and do throughout the day. And then I have a handful of practices that weave in and out through the rest of the day, and that's one of them.
Yeah.
But I think it's significant to think like what is that practice an example of? What are the underlying proto skills that are being used in that?
Mm.
Right. So to do a Genlin practice, even in like the standard focusing sense, right? You're using interoception, you're using intention, and you're applying the intention between different subjectively active systems within yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so then you go, okay, there's a lot of things that could be described in that way, right? And so all of those things form a set that we might call the meditations or the inner practices or something like that.
Yeah.
I think so. I think there's a real importance to generalizing these principles, because once you see that and you go, oh, I see, if I'm being moved forward in my self-development and my ability to generate a metacognitive intelligence every time I'm applying intention across the relationship between internal subsystems,
Mhm.
that's very interesting. I
Yeah.
might find a lot of different ways throughout the day that I might be able to do something like that.
Yeah.
And interestingly, that looks an awful lot like what we do interpersonally when we create a kind of intersubjective feeling quality that's worthwhile. And it also seems very much like what we would assume a functioning ecological network does. So this seems part and parcel of making a cathedral out of the world that stands before us at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny as again, I just want to just because it keeps striking me as you talk about like so the very thing you just described and the way you described it were very is very coherent. Like including kind of like just because I think what you just described is the way that all those things gather together, right? And as you're describing the practice of that thing, exercising that thing that makes those very connections and gathers them together, like it's just I don't know that that I noticed in this conversation with you, it just gives me it has me feel really good feelings. So thank you for that. Thank you for being you. Thank you for being that way.
That sounds pretty good to me.
This is really, really great. And so so that's what you do throughout the day. And do you have like an evening practice that you do? Anything specifically that you do in the evening?
Well, most of my evenings are, you know, family, girlfriend, food, that kind of stuff. The evening gets full. So I usually try to do the last practices definitively are usually in the late afternoon.
Yeah.
Or we might say that the practices shift to relational practices after that.
Yeah.
But if you have a sense of what I was saying the proto skills are, you can use that in anything, right?
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of classical, almost cliche to think about that late 20th century notion of Eastern philosophy where, I can make dinner, but I'm going to be really present. I'm going to be so mindful. I'm going to smell all the smells and all
Right.
that kind of stuff. All right. And it's a little bit lame, but there's some truth to it. And what it points at is the fact that you can apply consciousness, you can apply intention, you can apply the relationship between different internal systems to any of these activities that you're doing.
Yeah.
And very often, the simplest thing is simply one additional attention point to do on purpose.
Yeah.
Right. So let's say I'm making dinner, right? You might have some totally random thing. You're like, I'm going to attend to the sensation of my left eyelid for the entire process of making dinner.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm going to fail.
Yeah.
But by coming back to it again and again, I'm turning the process into something very analogous to a meditation.
Yeah.
And what I'm doing is enlivening my metacognitive capacity by applying intention to my internal systems in a way they wouldn't normally be activated in.
Right. Totally. So interesting. We're talking about this because I've been doing because I'm always tweaking stuff like that. Like it's why I'm kind of asking about this because I'm like throughout the day I'm constantly tweaking little exercises and like meditating. I don't know. I think if I actually tracked it, I probably I probably are spending 3, 4 hours a day doing some kind of explicit practice, right? But it usually is, it's like something, um, there are definite times where I just sit, right? And there's definite times where I do relational things. But you're right, at some level, it kind of a lot of these things, the principles of them apply at different things that I'm doing. And the one lately that I've been really getting into, um, is when I'm walking, is just really focusing on the farthest point in my periphery. And it's funny. Have you experimented with that much of like when you're, especially when you're walking, like just you just what's interesting about it is that you lay your eyes out into the distance, right? And then you just, because something about the movement affords this to be more alive, so you can, and in order to kind of focus on it, you actually, it's not an effort that goes like this, it's an effort that relaxes, like you have to continually relax back. So this, it seems to do this interesting thing where in order to do better, it triggers a relaxation response versus a concentration response, or an efforting response, where the efforting and the relaxation are the same thing. There's something about that that gives me this feeling of where I feel like I'm kind of like 1,000 miles wide by the time I'm like 3 or 4 blocks down in my neighborhood. Have you experimented with these kind of visual peripheral kinds of things at all? Do you know what's
Yeah, a
happening?
little bit. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to play with practices like that. And what I hear in that is two different things. One is practices that attend to the limit of what's perceptually or cognitively available in a moment, right? So the farthest out, but that's also the subtlest thought, or the quietest sound I can hear, or something like that, right? And even you get into Zen koan work, things like that, you're dealing with the limit of the mind's capacity, and somehow the encounter with the limit allows it to feed back on itself and organize itself.
Yeah.
But the other part of that is the expansion, or maybe decontraction would be a better way to say it, because our attentional and emotive processes compulsively contract, and in very predictable ways as well.
Mm.
So if we see that, feel that, release it, then we not only open up back into our full decontracted mode, but we also get this experience of contracting and expanding and contracting and expanding, which is very much the same kind of pulsatory process that every organism goes through, and allows us to end up achieving a kind of blending between focused engagement and expanded release. And you can go through a lot of the history of the mystics and go, these were people who thought that the relationships and engagements and identifications of the world were problematic, and they wanted to get consciousness or freedom or release or ease in some radical way. But the ones who really seem to have succeeded were the ones who discovered in that state that it can't be fundamentally different from all of the engagements. And so going back and forth between the contraction and the expansion allows, in a way, one way to think about it is consciousness to permeate the world in that kind of non-dualistic sense, right? There's other ways to phrase that and think about that, but the blending between the contracted and the expanded state is something that allows engagement to be experienced as liberating rather than as the opposite of liberation.
Yeah. It's funny as we're talking about it, this is linking into just a lot of the reading around Heidegger that I've been doing about that stuff where he goes into like this kind of withdrawal, like the withdrawing of the ground, right, is the very openness of that app ground, or that withdrawing, this kind of sense of nearness and withdrawal, and getting closer and closer and closer to that sense. It's funny, a lot of that's just, I've been reading a lot of that stuff as of late. So as you're talking about, it's hitting all of those. I'm like, oh, that's why, that makes a sense why like this particular practice is really speaking to me right now as well. Yeah, it's really great. Fortunately, I have to start coming to completion here. This has really been great talking with you, my friend.
Yeah, no, this is fabulous. And anytime you want to pick this conversation up in the future, I'm very
Oh
happy.
yeah. Let's do it. Let's do it. Maybe we can get John and get some other people, and we can have some multi-person dialogos is going on. This is great.
Absolutely. I mean, they're fantastic themes, and you seem like a great kind of guy to me.
Great. You too. All right. Yeah, don't look me up on the internet though then. All right, my friend. I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Yeah,
Bye-bye.
cheers. Nice to meet you, guy.